Hello, friends. I'm Asha and this morning, this noontime, we're talking to my dear friend Saiganesh. Say hello to the good people, Saiganesh.
Hello, Asha, and hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in.
Okay, this is our second round of series of talking to these five millennials who are integral to the leadership of Ananda Palo Alto. And today I'm going to talk to Saiganesh about the Indian epics, because this is something I know that he and I both share as an interest, and he's given classes and told stories, and so have I. I was going to start by saying back in 1967, 69, somewhere around in there, it might have been as late as 69, when I was really very new on the spiritual path. Somehow or another, I got my hands on the 3-volume, 1,000-page version of the Valmiki Ramayana. And I was very new into the path, and I started reading the Valmiki Ramayana, and it was a period of time when I lived in San Francisco. So it might have been just a little bit later than that. But I was living in San Francisco. I was working on Montgomery Street, which is a very famous chi sort of place to work, except I had a little tiny job on Montgomery Street, working in a legal office as a secretary of some sort. And I would read the Ramayana on the Giri Express bus. I would read it on the way to work. And then I worked for an enlightened company that allowed me, when I wasn't actually working, to read, which is like, that's really unusual, because I was running some kind of like a very early version of a word processor and printing out legal documents. And when I wasn't doing that, I could read. So for 3 months, I would read the Ramayana on the bus, and then I would read the Ramayana at work. At the end of 3 months, I got fired from the job. But by then, we had, Rama had saved Sita from Ravana, and it was all okay. But I got so lost in that story that I remember being on the bus, and I would look up and I would see everybody was just carrying out their lives as normal, where Sita had been kidnapped by the demon and we didn't know if we would get her back. And how could they just be living as if nothing was happening? And it was so extraordinary for me to immerse myself in that. Then, of course, when I went to India and discovered that everybody had grown up with these epics, I was so jealous, because it became so powerful for me and has remained so. So, with that little introduction, I know you've said before you had a very traditional upbringing in Chennai, as you've described it. So, what part did the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, play in that in your childhood memories?
Sure. I cannot actually remember who or when I started hearing the stories. I
Mm.
think perhaps most Indians would feel the same way as I do. It's sort of what you grow up with, but it's not a very specific recollection of like, oh, my mom told these stories when I was 7 years old, or I heard this from my grandparents, or something like that. I've always been fascinated and interested. And certainly there was a lot of, back when I grew up, uh, you had these series on TV, on the national television, where this was the entertainment we consumed for a large part. On Sunday mornings, you would have these Mahabharata and Ramayana play on the national television, and all of us, the family would get together and watch these and enjoy them. So it's certainly something Indians grow up with. I'm fascinated by what you're saying because I don't remember. I always remember knowing the stories.
Uh huh.
So there was no element of surprise as to what was going to happen.
Uh huh.
But much later in my life, I was reading an English novel by somebody, and this person was describing being in India and watching an enactment of the Mahabharata, and he knew the story already. And I remember a line in that novel where he said, "The best stories are ones whose end we already know."
Oh, how interesting. Uh huh.
So I think about that because I am, and not just, I don't think I'm unique in this way. A lot of us are interested in how the story is going to go, although we know that the good guy is going to win.
Uh huh.
So there's, I think, an element in these epics in scripture in general, but especially these kind of stories that are told, that are illustrative, that are about saints and of incarnations and God manifesting on this plane. These have a certain power, um, that we absorb without consciously knowing in our own minds.
I was very struck. Um, I started going to India in 1986, as I've mentioned, leading pilgrimages, and my first Indian friend was the man who was leading our pilgrimages, who was 24 at that time. We all grew up together after that. And I remember him talking to me about some incident from one of the epics. And, just so you know, the Mahabharata is related to the Bhagavad Gita, and the Ramayana is the story of the incarnation of Rama and Sita. I think almost everybody knows these. But in any case, he presented to me, he was explaining, we were talking some moral or some kind of an issue, I don't really know what, but he just told it to me. Rama did so and so in the Gita, and it was sort of like telling me that the president of India had done so and so. It was as factual to him as an event, and therefore a how to live event, as any other illustration that he might have come to. I mean, was that your feeling about it when you were that there?
Yes, certainly. And it took me a while to sort of reconcile because, in the Indian, you know, religion, there are these, you distinguish between itihasa and Purana, which means history and mythology.
Uh-huh.
And Ramayana and Mahabharata are considered history. And
Oh.
there's also a lot of mythology, like,
Uh-huh.
how Ganesha was born, or
Uh-huh.
how, that Indians know is not historical.
Uh-huh.
In my own life, and I think it includes a lot of people, not just of my, I would say of my generation, just like it's a hard sell. It could be a hard sell. Well, did this really happen? Did this really happen in the Mahabharata, that the sage was meditating and then somebody struck a bow and arrow and his head got shot and then his head fell on somebody's lap and then that burst into 1,000 pieces? And this is being presented as history. What part of this is factual? What part of this is imagination? How much of a poetic license is the writer actually taking? you know, I think as I matured and as I understood this teachings of self realization more, and also as I was able to contemplate more on it, I think the factual nature of it, I think it's a mental construct that the human mind is very attached to, in a
Uh-huh.
sense. Recently, we were watching a talk by Devarshiji in a group, and he was quoting Swami as saying, Swamiji, who has written so many books and so many talks and lectures, to one of Devarshi's questions, Swamiji said, "Words are but vicarious. How can I communicate with words to you?"
Huh.
And I'm sort of, saying that in response to what you just said, because I realize that we think of history as a fact and a sequence of events, and in a way that somehow translate into the exact specifics of what happened. But honestly, even our own memory is completely tinged by feeling.
Huh. Huh.
Feeling is evoked by symbols.
Huh.
So our memory itself is not actually as factual as we often think of it to be.
You
And when I think of the scriptures, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, I've learned to see why they're historical and why they're considered history, because it did happen. But the details and the specifics of it are the specifics of the vibration and the feeling of what exactly transpired, and
right.
not whether this person actually walked this way or whether this bow and arrow did that and whether the sky really turned red or,
Yeah. I read the introduction to a biography of Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna, and the author said, "This is not what I'm recording here is not biography, but legend." And he went on at great length to say how legend, when you're dealing with these realities that are beyond the egoic experience, that legend is actually more factual than fact, because legend actually, and you, I hadn't thought of it the way you put it, because legend can get the feeling across, and it can get us to understand that truth is not just the material plane. That's another way of thinking it. That we think the material plane is the truth, but the material plane is a reflection of a higher level of truth. Well, how has knowing these epics or being involved in these epics served you personally, either your personal growth, your professional life, your spiritual life? How has it helped you?
I would almost say there's a strong demarcation in my own approach to these before I discovered Masters Yogananda's teachings and after.
Hmm.
Uh, because I think I was absorbing a lot. I was deeply connecting. But I don't think I was integrating them in that same way as I was able to once I discovered the teachings of self realization.
Well,
Um, I think before, I would say, when I grew up with it, when these were all part of my everyday reality, so to speak, because I was drawn to these in a very, uh, from my heart. And certainly these images define my personal relationship with God, uh, not just the stories, but even just because when you even go to Indian temples, there's so much imagery. When you see an idol of Rama in an ancient temple, there's so much decoration, there's so much process, there's so much that happens in a ceremony. A lot of which you sort of just absorb. You don't know exactly what's happening. What is the priest going to do after this? Why are they putting this garland here? And why is he doing this arti all of a sudden out of the blue? So you absorb all of that on a very deep feeling level, which is what I think I did. Now I'm trying to make sense of all of that, speaking in past. Um, what the context of self realization gave me was a powerful way to clarify and integrate it. Uh, I have to say, when I talk about the Mahabharata sometimes, um, especially those in the West might think what Master brought, the interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita that Yogananda brought into this world, perhaps people think, oh, Indians grew up with it. They
mm,
perhaps know what Master's talking about. But I think I can speak for almost all Indians here who are not familiar with Master's teachings. What Master brought in the interpretation of these scriptures is revolutionary.
I see.
I think in the traditional Indian context, people were drawing deeply from these scriptures, and of course, elevating. They were elevated on a very deeply spiritual level, but the understanding of the symbolism of relating it to your personal practice, of using your will and your energy to move through life, uh, based on the teachings of these scriptures, was something that Yogananda channeled for particularly for this age, I think, for all of us in his interpretation of the Gita and the Mahabharata.
Well, give me an example of like one story that has been meaningful to you in a practical sense.
Yeah, well, the even the broader overarching symbolism in the Mahabharata,
Uh-huh.
simply the fact that Dhritarashtra represents the blind mind. Here is a king who has tied his eyes. And who has a wife who is sorry, he is the king who's blind, and he has a wife who has tied her eyes, and he has 100 sons. And there are all these stories about the 100 sons were not born over 100 years. If you know the story, it happens differently. Now, before the teachings of Yogananda, before coming across this interpretation of the Mahabharata, it might have just felt interesting. I perhaps was tuning into the vibration of the consciousness of what was being expressed, but it did not make sense to me on the deeper level.
Uh-huh.
Now I know that the blind mind is, in fact, it has no ability to perceive outside of the sensory reality. And his wife, who represents that power of desire, is has blinded herself by choice
Uh-huh.
associated with the mind, and now they engender all these desires, hundreds, uh,
Right.
that come as the Karwa brothers as their offsprings. So it's just one example, but I'm sure you're aware, but it all makes so much sense. And now you can apply it on a deeper level in your own life. Whereas earlier you were only tuning into it on a feeling level, or absorbing the consciousness or the vibration of the scripture, but not necessarily in that same clear way of how to apply it.
Of how to apply it. That's when I think about those heroic stories. Swami talks about in his Education for Life book, he talks about how the different stages of development from birth, and he talks about from 6 to 12 years old especially, we learn from 0 to 6 we're working with our physical body, from 6 to 12 we're working with our emotional body, and we're forming our ideals. And he talks at that time about the importance of story and about how story really, you get the feeling of heroes and the possibility of heroism. So would that be part of what you were feeling when you said, as a child, it would speak to it would go into your heart? I mean, what does that mean when you say it goes into your heart? Can you sort of say what that would be like? I mean, I sort of picture I've been in the Indian temples and I've seen devout mothers dragging their little sons around and putting them in front of the deities. So I can see it happening. Were you self-motivated or were you dragged by your elders?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because I think in my case, which was rather unusual when I grew up in India, because I was a lot with my peers, people of my age, I was very self-motivated. I don't. Of course, there was a lot that was uh, put on me and given to me, fed to me uh, because of my upbringing. Um, but I was rather neutral to it. I was always making up my own mind about what was being fed, but I was heavily self-motivated. I tell people it's not that I was a spiritual prodigy. It was more like some people are interested in race cars and others are interested in anime, and I was just interested in scriptures. That's how I personally see it too. It's
Uh-huh,
that even from a very young age, I just had a fascination. It was more like a hobby,
uh-huh,
but a hobby that served me really, really well spiritually.
uh-huh,
So when I say I was absorbing it on a feeling level, it was a fascination. It
uh-huh,
was more of a fascination, and like the wide-eyed look of a child. Wow,
uh-huh,
isn't this interesting? I'm so drawn to this. Uh,
uh-huh.
I couldn't explain it any better, but the images would stay in my mind and sort of be something that would consume my reality. I couldn't explain why or how. But even when I look back at it, I just think of it as an interest that I came into this life with.
Right, of course. You know, what you're describing is the way I felt about the Ramayana when I was like 22 or something. I must have been about 22. I mean, I felt the Ramayana was more real to me than the life that I was living in San Francisco at that time. And it was really strange for me because it just came absolutely out of nowhere. But you know that um, let me think. You know, it is history, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, because they're both real avatars. So maybe you could make a distinction a little bit about, like, there's a difference between an avatar and a god or a goddess. Why don't you speak to that, sort of
Yeah,
the difference between history and mythology from that point of view?
yeah, certainly. So So, like I said, we use two different Sanskrit words in India to
Right.
refer. One is called itihasa, which literally means history, and Puranas, which is just stories or mythology. And in mythology, like when you talk about Shiva, when you talk about Kali, oh, Shiva did this to Kali, and then Ganesha was born this way, then what you're really communicating is. I don't think Indians or the Indian religion necessarily intellectualizes this the
Right.
same way I'm explaining. I think I'm also speaking from a Western mind in which I was educated. I think when we express stories that way, when we talk about God with these different forms, with 100 hands, so many eyes or so many heads, I think we are trying to communicate concepts that are vibrational. We are trying to put symbols in, that evoke a certain imagery. And even the stories, I think they all have teachings, even to take literally. But more importantly, I think the stories are giving to us ways in which we can relate to these states of consciousness. If you think, for example, of Lakshmi, the scriptures, even the older scriptures, talk of Lakshmi as gold, the
Uh-huh.
light of gold, the luster of that metal. That's
Uh-huh.
a symbol, you see, and that symbol has a vibration um, that is that of prosperity and abundance.
Hmm.
Then now we have an anthropomorphic form of a human lady, because it is a female vibration of creative abundance, who's
Hmm.
sitting on a lotus and with four hands and all of that. And now that is evoking an imagery in your heart. And now you create a relationship with that vibration through your heart. And that becomes, and then it opens up another doorway for devotion and self offering in that way. Now, on the other hand, we have the history or the itihasas like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Like you said, these are talking about fully realized souls, God Himself incarnating in flesh as Rama and Krishna, and playing the Leela, the divine play of showing to those that were around that time, demonstrating or having a role in history or whatever that was. These avatars, this history is important for us because it goes back to even the subject of yugas.
Hmm.
because without that context of history, it is very easy to assume that where we are living is always the apex of civilization.
Mm,
Uh,
mhm,
whereas
mhm,
the Indian history presents to us, the Indian history, I mean all these scriptures, not the what is there in the history textbooks in India, but this Indian history presents to us the nature of time, the nature of uh, planetary cycles, of
mhm,
how life itself, how God himself takes an active interest in the world, and also all these other characters that played a role, because then you see in these stories people of all different consciousness, in the Mahabharata, not just the Pandavas and the Kauravas, but so many characters that we can relate to as a story. But once we are able to dig into it deeper, we realize, wow, all these people are inside me, which is the teaching that Yogananda brought for us. So that the Itihasas, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they open up our eyes in that way to reality that is much broader than what we see and experience in the present day.
mhm.
And their teachings, they also present symbols, and they also present a lot of symbolic ways of expressing the truth, but uh, they are different because they are talking about a certain time, a certain way divine incarnated, and the stories associated with that.
Now tell me, do you think that this is all passé? That let's talk about millennials. That ambitious young people who are working with the tech world and can create any virtual reality they want. Do you think that these scriptures that their day is past, or do you think that there's a message here that I mean to people of your tribe of people in their 30s, whether they're Asian or not Asian? Do you think these stories are still relevant?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly the way I passionately feel. I mean, of course, I cannot say that. I have to say, I perhaps don't share the common millennial view in my passion for how I feel these are relevant today.
Uh-huh.
Perhaps most others think they are passe. But I think one of the ways I think about it is when we look at spirituality, even like, for example, even somebody who's perfectly agnostic or does not have any relationship with Christian church or Christ, suddenly their parent dies and then they want a blessing from a Catholic priest, or they have a child and they want the child to be baptized. Somehow we know that our conception is not complete, and we look to something bigger and broader and to religion and spirituality when we don't know exactly what it is that we want. And in
Right.
that way, for millennials, I think when we look at these scriptures, when we look at this, I think that's the reason I quote that, is because I think it's the same way in India. Even
Uh-huh.
those of my generation who don't understand or clearly know the symbolism or the differences between this and that, or don't know what the import of the Mahabharata or Ramayana is, they do look up to religion that way. They
Uh-huh.
know there are saints. They know there's a power in these temples. When they are having a crisis in their life, they know they have to pray.
Right.
And so it will serve us to integrate these worlds. This
Right.
Western world that we are a part of right now, how we relate to the world completely from our minds and the intellectual reality, and
Right.
this vibrational reality of consciousness that has been passed through ages, I think that's what Yogananda brought. You can
Right.
integrate all of this, you can make sense of this. You don't have to blindly believe all of this, thinking somehow, oh, I don't believe Rama actually flew on the air, or I don't, I don't think a monkey can do that. It doesn't matter. Now this is giving you solutions for what it is that you're facing in your life, and if you would take time, or if you would put out the energy to go deeper into these scriptures,
Right.
it is actually going to give you what you're looking for.
It's interesting. I know you have posted through Facebook, Saiganesh Sairam. You've been able, people can find your commentaries and your storytelling. I have storytelling also on my YouTube channel. Here's something that's interesting to me. I mean, the thing that people are most interested in these days is superheroes. I was in a perfectly, other kind of panel, and the way we were supposed to introduce ourselves was to tell people what our superpower was, and I being so out of it. I mean, it didn't, I was able to go along, but I just thought to myself, good heavens, look at that. And I mean, here's another, just the way I accidentally stumble into these things. I was looking at a pattern book, to sew something. And I went into the costume section, and three-quarters of the costumes are fantasy characters of one kind or another. So, but what one of the things that you're touching on, and I wanted to say it, is like scripture has a power that is completely different than storytelling, and it's just vibrational. That's why people can read the Bible over and over and over again, because you know how the story ends, so there's no suspense, just what you're saying, but there's a living vibration there. Master said, wherever a great master has been, the vibration lingers. So when you're working with these stories, what you're picking up, and this is what you're saying, is you're not just getting an exciting tale, but you're actually coming into relationship with the living avatar. So this has been the genius, perhaps, of those epics. Would you say that that's sort of what it is?
Yeah, certainly. It is a living reality. And you have traveled a lot in India. I'm sure a lot of viewers watching this perhaps have been to India or at least familiar with that reality. Even if you walk into a Hindu temple here in the Bay Area, there's a reality that you walk into. There,
Uh-huh.
that image, there are those six hands, there's all these garlands, there is that milk being poured, and this, it's a reality that we are tuning into. It wouldn't serve us to necessarily have to intellectualize all parts of it,
Right.
but to even open ourselves to scriptures, to these teachings, to Sanatan Dharma being presented this way has so much to offer to us. I'll just one more comment on the superheroes.
Yeah.
Recently, somebody asked me, I have been, somebody, as someone who's not from this culture, I was talking to a friend of mine, how do Americans pick names? Eric and, Connor or whatever, you know. And he said, sometimes, if people are religious, they pick biblical characters or whatever. Others, they just, pick whatever they like the sound of. And
And
yeah,
no,
and
go
I
ahead.
was saying, we were saying, he was asking, would Mukunda be a very presumptuous name? This was somebody who's a devotee of Yogananda. And I said, absolutely not. There's so many people with that name in India. And then he said, but then it is the name of such a great avatar, of a self. And then I looked at him and said, then nobody can name their child Shiva or Krishna or anything. But
Yeah,
that's the superhero that we are looking up to, and we are affirming and drawing that vibration in our life. So, you know, that's why we name children in India always with names of gods.
yeah. Actually, that's a very interesting point. When I changed my name to Asha, which I did, Swami changed it when my very early 20s, but it's a constant affirmation what people call you, and it does seem to waste it on a word like tulip or something like that, although that's better than some. But sometimes it's just a sound, where as if it's a vibration, it would be so much more powerful. This is, it's a very interesting way to pick it back up, because going back to the superhero concept, it's like the movie is fantasy, but this is not fantasy.
Yeah, exactly. Because you are tuning in, like, for example, when we teach meditation, I obviously tell people, see light here or imagine a five-pointed star or blue light. And then I tell people, this is not, bright blue sky or some kind of imaginary reality. Even if you don't see it, imagine it, because you're tuning into something that is absolutely real, even if it is not within your perception right at this moment. And our effort to tune into it is going to reveal it more and more to us as we try.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And thus, if we're going to entertain ourselves with stories, it might as well be stories that take us somewhere. I mean, even imaginary stories can be tuned into a real truth, but I love that, the historical epics put us in tune with beings that are still there blessing us. Yeah, that would be. That's why they say when I read the Valmiki Ramayana, they told me what a blessing I got just for reading it. Do
Yeah.
you feel that way? Do you feel you've been blessed by this?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel blessed every time. I mean, right now in my life, I perhaps pick the autobiography of a yogi more than Ramayana and the Mahabharata. But I feel blessed every time I pick it up, because I feel blessed by the presence of Yogananda.
Uh-huh.
The book, when I first read it, it's very hard to know what was happening or what I was even feeling. I was tuned into the feeling of that book. But as I spend more years as a devotee and disciple of Yogananda, and as I pick that book more and more, I'm just so deeply aware that I'm just picking something that is absolutely not of the mind. Of course, there are English words, I want to understand what I'm reading, but I read it with that same feeling. When I open the autobiography of Yogi, I receive Yogananda.
Right.
And it is as deep a scripture to me as Mahabharata and the Ramayana, because I am tuning into that, into the living presence of that avatar who came for us.
Exactly. Saiganesh, it's very interesting to talk to you. I mean, I know you, but nonetheless, I rarely interview you, or I never interview. But it's just an interesting comment, which these are characteristics I think you and I both share. Obviously, self-evidently, both of us use our minds a lot. We like to think things through. We're both articulate. We both talk fast and have lots of words. But what I'm struck by is how many times in this interview you use the word feeling, which is the truth. It's the truth of your nature, mine also as I know it. How very interestingly these two realities play together. And I think your passion for the epics and mine is in a very interesting place. I think where thought, where intellect and feeling really come very, very, very strongly together. And it's something that I hope those who are listening may also find um, an avenue into a wonderful exploration. Well, thank you very much for sharing this time
Thank
with
you,
me.
Asha.
God bless you.